There are people who feel stuck without knowing exactly why. They think, evaluate, consider possibilities, but something always prevents the next step. Decisions are postponed, actions remain half done, and life moves forward within narrow limits. It is not a lack of ability. Often it is fear, a fear that does not present itself clearly, but that influences important choices without being noticed. Billy Graham observed this kind of blockage closely. For him, when fear controls decisions unnoticed, it does not appear as panic but as excessive caution. The person believes they are being prudent, when in fact they are being guided by something that prevents them from moving forward. This blockage is rarely recognized immediately. The person does not usually say, "I am afraid." Instead, they say they are still thinking, that it is not the right time, that they need more security. Decisions remain suspended. Changes are always postponed for later, and this later keeps stretching out with no clear date to arrive. On the outside, everything seems reasonable. There are arguments, care, justifications. On the inside, however, there is a constant feeling of restraint. The person wants to move forward, but feels that something is holding them back. There is no concrete obstacle. There is only an internal limit that is hard to explain, yet respected as if it were necessary. Over time, this way of functioning becomes habitual. The person learns to live within what they already know. They avoid new situations, difficult conversations, choices that would require exposure, not because they lack ability, but because the risk of failing, losing, or being disappointed seems too great. So they remain where they are, even while feeling they could go further. This blockage also affects small decisions, not only major changes. Simple choices begin to require excessive effort. The person reviews, reconsiders, pulls back. Everything needs to be very certain before it happens. And since it is never completely certain, many things never happen. The most difficult part is that this blockage is often mistaken for personality. The person begins to define themselves as cautious, reserved, controlled. They do not realize that behind this lies a fear that has been shaping limits and paths. A discrete but persistent fear that organizes life without being named. Recognizing this blockage does not mean acting immediately. It simply means realizing that not every delay is a conscious choice. Sometimes it is fear operating in silence, preventing movements that deep down have already been considered many times. In many cases, fear does not appear as something obvious. It presents itself as excessive care. The person believes they are being responsible, mature, realistic. They tell themselves that it is not the right moment yet, that it is better to wait a little longer, that it is not worth taking risks now. Everything sounds sensible. Everything seems well thought out. The problem is that this prudence is never satisfied. There is always some guarantee missing. There is always one more variable to consider. There is always the possibility that something might go wrong, and while the person waits for ideal conditions, movement is suspended. The decision does not happen, not because it has not been analyzed, but because fear demands total certainty before allowing any step. This type of fear is difficult to identify because it does not shout. It argues, it uses logic, it presents convincing reasons not to move forward. The person feels safe by not acting, but also feels frustrated for remaining in the same place. There is a constant tension between the desire to change and the need to avoid risk. Billy Graham observed that many people confuse this state with wisdom. He realized that true prudence does not paralyze, it guides. When caution begins to prevent any progress, something has stopped being care and has become control. And this control is born from the fear of failing, losing, or being disappointed. Over time, this pattern creates an internal habit. The person begins to distrust any impulse toward change. They question decisions before even trying them. Life continues safely but limited. There are no major falls, but there is also no real expansion. Thus, fear remains disguised, not as a clear threat, but as a voice that always asks for more time, more analysis, more guarantees. And while this voice is not recognized for what it is, the person believes they are simply being prudent, when in fact they are being prevented from moving forward. When fear begins to guide choices, decisions stop being made based on what one desires and start being made based on what one wants to avoid. The main question is no longer what makes sense for me, but what could go wrong. Life starts to be organized to reduce risks, not to seek direction. This appears in both small and large choices. The person avoids conversations that could generate conflict, avoids changes that would require adaptation, avoids paths that involve exposure. Not because there is no interest, but because the emotional cost seems too high. So they choose what is familiar, predictable, and controllable. Over time, this logic becomes stronger. Each avoided decision reinforces the idea that staying where one is feels safer. The person feels relieved for not having taken the risk, but that relief is brief. Soon, another feeling appears, the sense of being stuck, of watching possibilities pass by without taking part in them. These choices are rarely perceived as fear. They are justified as common sense. It's not the right time. Now isn't possible. Maybe later. Life keeps being postponed in the name of safety, and the more one avoids, the narrower the path becomes. The cost of this pattern does not appear immediately. It shows up gradually, as a diffuse frustration, a feeling of stagnation, the impression that something was left behind. The person cannot point exactly to what was lost, only feels that they could be somewhere else if they had trusted themselves more. Deciding in order to avoid is not cowardice, it is an attempt at protection. But when this logic dominates, it does not protect only from mistakes. It also protects from experience, learning, and movement, and so fear begins to control the course of life not through major prohibitions, but through small choices always made in the direction of the lowest risk. Billy Graham closely observed people who felt paralyzed without fully understanding why. He noticed that many times fear did not present itself as something explicit, but as a discrete force that organized choices, limits, and behaviors. The person believed they were simply being cautious, when in fact they were being guided by unrecognized fears. For him, this type of fear did not come from nowhere. It was formed from previous experiences in which making mistakes was costly, taking risks brought losses, or exposure generated pain. The inner self then learns to avoid similar situations, not out of lack of courage, but as an attempt at self-protection. Fear begins to function as a constant filter over what feels possible or permitted. Billy Graham understood that this process is rarely conscious. The person does not decide to live in fear. They simply adjust their movements to avoid suffering again. Over time, these adjustments become habits. Fear stops being a reaction and becomes a structure. It defines how far to go, what to try, what to avoid. This perspective did not come with judgment. He saw that the blockage was not a sign of moral weakness or personal incapacity. It was the sign of someone who learned to protect themselves too much. Someone who at some point needed to be careful in order not to get hurt and never revisited that caution. In observing this, Billy Graham did not seek to push the person into immediate action. He recognized that fear, when it is not perceived, ends up making decisions in the person's place. And while this happens, life continues to be organized more around what one is trying to avoid than around what one truly desires. This type of fear is not something one is born with. It is learned. It forms from experiences in which moving forward brought consequences that were difficult to handle. A decision that went wrong, an exposure that led to rejection, an attempt that ended in loss. The inner self records these experiences and begins to use them as reference. Over time, fear stops being tied to a specific event and spreads. The person no longer remembers exactly where it came from, but feels its effects. There is a constant caution, a tendency to imagine negative scenarios even before acting. The past begins to influence the present silently, shaping limits that seem natural but were built. This learning happens without conscious reflection. The inner self simply concludes that it is safer not to repeat certain situations. The problem is that fear does not make precise distinctions, it generalizes. What was dangerous in one context begins to be avoided in many others. The field of action gradually narrows. Billy Graham perceived that people like this were not weak. They were people shaped by experiences that required adaptation. He understood that learned fear is not a sign of lack of faith in oneself, but of active emotional memory. a memory that continues to guide choices even when the circumstances are no longer the same. This fear does not block only major decisions, it interferes with small, everyday movements. Conversations avoided. Ideas left unspoken, paths unexplored. Life continues in an organized way but constrained. There are no major mistakes, but there is also no real freedom to try. As long as this fear remains unrecognized, it continues to act as a hidden guide. The person believes they are simply being sensible, when in fact they are responding to old learnings that were never revisited. And so the past continues to decide the present, even without being consciously remembered. When fear prevents decisions, the absence of choice also begins to carry a cost. Not deciding seems neutral, but it is not. Life keeps moving forward, even when the person remains still. Time passes, circumstances change, and what was postponed slowly turns into silent loss. At first, not deciding brings relief. It avoids mistakes, frustration, exposure. The person feels protected. But this relief does not last. Gradually, another feeling emerges, the sense of falling behind. Not in comparison to others, but in relation to oneself. There is a growing distance between what is thought and what is lived. This cost appears subtly, a dissatisfaction that is hard to explain, the impression that something important never happens, plans that remain only as ideas, desires that are adjusted to fit within what is possible, not what is desired. Life becomes organized but limited. Not deciding also reinforces fear. Each time the person avoids a choice, they internally confirm that moving forward would be dangerous. Fear grows stronger because it is never confronted. It begins to feel more real than it actually is, simply because it has never been tested. In this way, paralysis feeds on itself. Billy Graham understood that this dynamic was not laziness or lack of ambition. It was a cycle of self-protection that had become excessive. He perceived that when someone avoids deciding for too long, they begin to live a life that was not chosen, only accepted. The greatest cost is not making mistakes. It is not trying. It is realizing over time that many decisions have already been made by fear, without the person noticing. And when this becomes clear, the feeling is not guilt, but loss. The loss of possibilities that never came to exist because they were never chosen. Fear does not sustain itself alone. It is reinforced by the environment. There are expectations, comparisons, and external standards that increase the sense of risk. The person observes others' mistakes, exposed failures, quick judgments. They learn that making mistakes is costly. That exposure can bring consequences that are hard to endure. In this context, excessive caution seems reasonable. Not deciding becomes a strategy. Staying where one is feels safer than taking risks in a scenario where everything is evaluated, commented on, and compared. External pressure blends with internal fear, making it even harder to distinguish prudence from blockage. Billy Graham observed that many people were not controlled only by their personal fears, but by a constant climate of expectation. He understood that when the environment does not tolerate failure, the inner self learns to avoid it at any cost. Fear stops being merely an individual reaction and becomes a collective response. This scenario reinforces the idea that moving forward is only allowed when there is a guarantee of success. Since such a guarantee rarely exists, the person remains waiting. Movement is always postponed to a safer moment that almost never arrives. Thus, fear gains strength not only within, but outside as well. It is fed by examples, narratives, and comparisons that suggest that failure is unacceptable. And while this pattern is not recognized, the person continues to believe they do not decide, because the time is not yet right, when, in many cases, it is fear that defines the timing. Over time, the person begins to clearly feel that they are stuck. There is a desire for change, but no movement. The ideas exist, the plans have been thought through, but something prevents execution. Life seems suspended at an intermediate point, neither moving forward nor backward. This sensation generates frustration, not because the person does not know what they want, but because they cannot allow themselves to try. The blockage is not intellectual, it is emotional. There is an internal force that breaks any step involving risk, even when the risk is small. Billy Graham understood that this state is more exhausting than action itself. He perceived that living restrained requires constant energy. The person needs to justify their own immobility, to explain to themselves why they have not acted yet, why they have not changed. Fear consumes energy, even without producing movement. Being stuck also affects how the person sees themselves. Self-confidence diminishes. Doubt increases. Each postponement reinforces the idea of incapacity. The person begins to believe they do not move forward because they cannot, when in reality, they do not move forward because they are afraid. This confusion is painful. The desire to live something different coexists with a sense of helplessness. The person pressures themselves, compares themselves, questions themselves, and the more they pressure themselves, the harder it becomes to act. The blockage closes in. Feeling stuck is not a sign of lack of will, it is a sign of unresolved internal conflict, a conflict between the desire to move forward and the fear of facing consequences. As long as this conflict remains hidden, the person stays still even while wanting to move. Here the pace slows again, not to push action, nor to demand immediate courage, only to allow the blockage to be perceived without judgment. When someone lives stuck because of fear, they usually pressure themselves even more, and this pressure only reinforces paralysis. There are people who have already tried to force themselves to act. They made lists, promises, plans, but they felt that something inside resisted. Not out of laziness, but out of protection. Fear does not respond well to pressure. It strengthens when it is attacked. Perhaps it is possible simply to recognize this state, to recognize that the blockage exists, that it is not a lack of character nor incapacity, it is a response built over time, and learned responses do not disappear by command. This pause does not ask for a decision, it does not ask for movement, it asks only for clarity. Clarity that being stuck is exhausting, but understandable, that fear did not arise out of nowhere, that it has history, memory, and function. Here, there is no invitation to defeat fear. There is space to notice how it has been guiding choices without being noticed. And this perception by itself already begins to change something, not in external pace, but in how the blockage is seen. At the center of this blockage, there is almost always the fear of making mistakes. Not the simple, everyday mistake, but the mistake that seems to define who the person is. In this context, making a mistake does not mean merely learning. It means failing as a person, disappointing others, losing value. Billy Graham observed that many people avoided decisions not because they did not know what to do, but because they could not bear the idea of being wrong. He understood that when error is seen as a threat to identity, any choice becomes too heavy. This fear manifests as perfectionism, excessive preparation, constant postponement. The person wants certainty before acting, wants to guarantee they will not regret it. But since there is no guarantee, action never happens. The fear of making mistakes paralyzes because it turns every step into an existential risk. It is not just a possible error, it is a threat to how the person sees themselves and believes they are seen. As long as this fear remains active, moving forward seems too costly. Over time, fear stops being a reaction and becomes control. It organizes schedules, choices, limits. It defines how far to go, what to try, what to avoid. The person believes they are in control, but it is fear that is deciding. Billy Graham understood that this type of control creates a predictable life, but a narrow one. Everything functions within safe limits, but little happens outside them. The person protects themselves from error, but also from experience. Fear begins to dictate the rhythm. It determines when to act, when to stop, when to retreat. And because fear is never satisfied, movement is always conditioned on something that never arrives. This control does not bring peace. It brings constant tension. The person must monitor their own life to avoid stepping outside what is considered safe. And this vigilance is exhausting. Recognizing this is not about losing control. It is about realizing who is actually in control. And that realization changes the place fear occupies, even if it does not yet change behavior. After all of this, there is no simple answer. The fear that blocks movement does not disappear just because it has been recognized. It may remain there, influencing choices for some time. What changes is the awareness that it exists and that it is not the only possible voice. Billy Graham used to observe these processes without haste. He understood that fear is not confronted with force, but with understanding, with time, with honesty about what it has been protecting and what it has been limiting. Recognizing that fear has been making decisions in silence already alters something important. The person stops treating themselves as incapable and begins to see that a legitimate internal conflict is taking place. And legitimate conflicts require care, not judgment. Nothing needs to be decided now. The blockage does not need to be broken today. Perhaps the first movement is not action but awareness. Awareness of where fear has been speaking louder than desire, where caution has turned into a prison. This awareness does not solve everything, but it opens space, and space is always the first step for something different to eventually happen. If you feel that fear has been influencing your decisions without you realizing it, if you notice that you are avoiding more than choosing, I suggest that you subscribe to the channel, because this space was created to help identify these internal blockages with calm and clarity, without pressure to act before the right time. Here, reflections accompany slow human processes, inspired by the way Billy Graham observed people trapped in internal conflicts that were not visible on the outside. By subscribing, you gain continuity, content that helps you understand your fears, reduce paralysis, and return to decisions with greater awareness. And if you wish, the comments remain open as a simple space for expression. Sometimes, putting fear into words is already a sufficient beginning.